Welcome back, everyone. Well, we are diving into a topic that I've been kind of putting off for a while, but I think I'm ready to finally tackle this very lengthy subject. It's one of the most important events in world history that nobody really knows a lot about. I mean, those of us who love history and who study it a lot do, but the average person probably couldn't tell you the first thing about the Congress of Vienna, but it in many ways created the modern world, at least in Europe, and it created the world that set the stage for the big wars of the 20th century. It kind of bridged the Napoleonic time into the modern time. It happens right at a consequential time in history with the Industrial Revolution in full swing, and there's so much to unpack here. So I'm ready to dive into this. I don't know how far we'll get today. This is going to be a multi-part series, I'm sure, because there's, like an hour and a half worth of content here. So I'll put the link in the description. As always, you can check out Historia Civilis and see the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into part one of the Congress of Vienna.
By the summer of 1814, the combined strength of Europe brought France to its knees. After almost 25 years of war, Europe was finally at peace. Nobody knew this at the time, but the peace that was negotiated here and now served as the launching pad for a 99-year run without a major war between great powers.
Not entirely sure I would say a 99-year run without a major war between great powers. I mean, I feel like the Franco-Prussian War is a major war between great powers. Maybe what he means is a war with multiple great powers, like alliances on both sides, which, is what you had with the Napoleonic Wars, because you have these coalitions that form against the might of the French Empire. But I feel like that's a little bit misleading.
A monumental achievement.
Mostly it's said at the bottom. So it's really important to note here too that you look at the map and you can start to get a sense of why things change so much by the time you get to the 20th century. Look at how Italy is broken up into multiple different states. And look at how, of course, Germany is broken up into many different states. You've got Prussia kind of dominating things, but you've got all these independent states that are eventually going to be formed into Germany later on in the 19th century. And the same thing goes with Italy. And you're going to start to see power get kind of like absorbed into smaller and smaller numbers of states.
Hostilities ceased. The immediate problem was that nobody quite knew what the world looked like anymore. The preliminary peace agreement that ended the war in 1814 restored international borders as they had existed in 1792, with some slight modifications. But these borders on the map no longer reflected the reality on the ground. The Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, existed on paper, but in reality it was under Russian occupation. All of these tiny German states existed on paper, but in reality they were under Prussian control. France existed on paper, but in reality it was under the joint occupation of the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British.
A lot like what you see in the aftermath of World War II with occupation zones, things like that.
All that being said, by the summer of 1814, the Treaty of Paris had been signed. The 1792 borders had been temporarily thrown back into place, and the war was over, at least for now. The urgent task at hand was to take this hyper-volatile international system and transform it into something more stable. Most people recognized that the 1792 borders were no good in the long run, because those borders had led directly to almost 25 years of war.
And it's interesting to note that throughout history, whenever you have multinational organizations determining the borders of countries, it typically just creates more problems. We saw that throughout the 20th century when nations were carved out of empires and the problems that created.
The prevailing mood among the victors was that a well-balanced international system was necessary. one that could resist the kind of reckless expansionism that the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world. But before we talk about the new system that was created at this time, let's first discuss the 5 great powers as they existed in 1814. This whole period of instability began with the French Revolution, so let's start with France. Defeated, under enemy occupation, but nevertheless, still a great power. When Napoleon was defeated, the Allied victors imposed a set of peace conditions upon France. All things considered, they were pretty
And we all know how well those tend to go also, don't we?
moderate. The first of these called for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy from before the Revolution. This brought the 58-year-old King Louis XVIII to the throne, the younger brother to the king that was executed under.
So why is he Louis XVIII and not Louis XVII? Well, Louis the XVI, who was executed during the French Revolution, in the aftermath of that, had a son, Louis XVII, who basically lived in prison and died there. And they have since, there have been a lot of claimants saying, and this happens a lot throughout history, people saying, oh, he didn't really die in prison, I'm King Louis XVII, but they've proven that it was indeed him that died in prison. So then Louis XVIII comes to the throne, and of course that doesn't last very long either.
Under the Revolution. The second condition for peace was a shiny new French constitution that would guarantee certain political rights. The third condition was an agreement from the new king to leave many of the revolutionary reforms in place. The massive redistribution of wealth and land was to be mostly upheld by the new regime. So it goes. The old French aristocracy were allowed to safely return to the country, but they were a shadow of their former selves, and never again rose to the dominant political position that they had enjoyed in the 18th century. The restoration of the Bourbon king was intended to make the conservatives happy. The new constitution was intended to make the moderate liberals happy. The preservation of the Republican reforms was intended to make the revolutionaries happy. Yep. It was a big, sloppy compromise.
And what tends to happen is when you make compromises like this, nobody's happy. And you're just kind of setting the stage for the next form of unhappiness.
And its purpose was to hold France together so that there was actually a France for the Allies to negotiate with. Despite its recent defeat, France remained a heavyweight on the continent. They were the second most populous country in Europe, and still controlled the most potent military force in the world. So long as those facts remained true, France would remain a great power. With that in mind, France's objective going into the upcoming peace negotiations was, to the extent possible, minimize any future French concessions or territorial losses. Many European leaders understood that France would need to opt in to any new international system if there was to be lasting peace.
So you see already here, in some ways, this Congress of Vienna and this idea of an international system is one of the early attempts at what eventually would be the League of Nations after World War I, and then the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II. As we're into the Industrial Revolution and we're into a time when communication is happening faster and you're starting to see the beginning stages of revolutions take place. Over the next couple of decades, we're going to see additional revolutions happening in Europe. You start to see this idea of an international community starting to form.
Others were simply out for blood. France's job for the immediate future would be to keep the wolves at bay.
As best you can, after losing.
To this end, the new king brought in an experienced hand to serve as his foreign minister, Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a French nobleman who got in on the ground floor of the French Revolution.
Yep.
Through the revolution, he became a politician, then a diplomat, then an early supporter of Napoleon. Talleyrand served as Napoleon's foreign minister for 8 years, until the two had a falling out, and Talleyrand resigned. After this, Talleyrand began telling others that Napoleon's endless lust for war would bring ruin upon France.
Talleyrand, once played by none other than John Malkovich in a movie, which is kind of cool.
In time, he began passing intelligence to France's enemies and launched preliminary discussions with them regarding what a post-Napoleonic France might look like. This relationship made him an obvious choice to bring back into government after France was defeated.
This is just a classic brilliant politician reading the way the wind's blowing and going with it, right? He's part of the revolution, but he's able to stay on even into Napoleon's time. Then when he sees Napoleon going in a direction that's going to lead to his downfall, he kind of starts doing what he needs to do so that even when Napoleon's regime doesn't survive, he does. It's pretty brilliant stuff.
That's the generous way of looking at Talleyrand. The ungenerous way of looking at him is that he was a cockroach, a survivor, an opportunist. Every time the political winds began to shift, Talleyrand suddenly found himself on the other side. Every time the French government looked unstable, Talleyrand found an excuse to be out of the country.
So, I mean, it's cockroach is probably a fair way to describe it, but it's survival, right? I mean, it's understanding the situation, and he's kind of an Aaron Burr, but a successful one. Aaron Burr was kind of the same thing in the United States, but he tended to find himself on the outside looking in rather than on the inside looking out.
When it became clear that France would not win the war, Talleyrand was the first to abandon ship. Boats.
Random dog.
But no matter what you think of him, Talleyrand became the most powerful person in the French government after the fall of Napoleon. And yes, I am including the king when I say that.
Yeah,
his great task as foreign minister would be to keep the wolves at bay and reintegrate France back into the international order as a co-equal great power.
And you might think on the surface, well, who is France to have any say in what happens? They've just been beaten. Yeah, but like he said, France is still a great power. This is not like post World War II where Germany has just basically been obliterated as a power. Their ability to make war has been destroyed. They're really in no position to do anything without being rebuilt with Allied help. France, while they've lost militarily and they've lost literally millions of men in the process, so have the other the coalition powers lost millions of men, and they've been weakened as well. France is still very strong. So they've got something to stand on when it comes to kind of keeping the wolves at bay.
Let's now turn our attention to the four great powers that brought Napoleonic France to its knees, starting with the greatest of the great powers and working our way down.
I like how he's doing this. This is a cool way to look at this. Of course, it's important to note, and I know we tend to use these terms interchangeably, but by 1814, we're talking about the United Kingdom. This is something you hear me describe all the time, but, the Acts of Union in, I think, 1707 creates Great Britain. And so during the American Revolution, for example, it is Great Britain. It's Scotland, England, Wales. That's the nation. But by the time we get to 1814, you've seen Ireland merged into that to become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland.
As always, the historian Eric Hobsbawm puts it better than I ever could. Britain, quote, had by 1815 gained the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world, having emerged from 20 years of war against France as the only industrialized economy, the only naval power, and virtually the only colonial power in the world. The thing that made Britain the greatest of the great powers was the Royal Navy. Sometimes people talk about strategic depth, which is the idea that during wartime, you want the lines of battle drawn as far from your major population centers as possible. In 1815, Britain's strategic depth extended to all the world's oceans and beyond.
And this is an important point that has been a big plus, obviously, for the UK, is their status as kind of an island nation, which even though they have been heavily involved in these wars, like the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, for the most part, they've kept the war away from their shores. Now we know, World War II especially, the Blitz, there's a lot of damage that happened in World War I some too. But for the most part, they're not devastated like Germany and France and other nations are by these wars.
No country has ever been safer from invasion.
Japan,
the moment
maybe?
of Britain's great victory was also a moment of great uncertainty for the British monarchy. George III was king and was unable to enjoy Britain's newfound prosperity. George probably suffered from a number of genetic disorders, as well as other things like bipolar disorder and dementia.
Yeah, porphyria is the general one that they talk to. It's a blood disorder. And yeah, other things might have come on by this point. They talk about the madness of King George. So he's under a regency by this point. His son, who would go on to be George IV, is the Prince Regent.
At times, it was quite bad. He was in constant physical pain and suffered from hallucinations, delusions, and memory loss. He was occasionally coherent, but not often and not for long. In 1811, at the height of the war, the British Parliament transferred the powers of the monarchy to the king's 48-year-old son, which made him the Prince Regent. Within a few years, the king was no longer presentable enough to appear in public.
So we hear about this all throughout history, the idea of regency. In other words, when somebody is somebody's the monarch, but they're unable to exercise that authority on their own. Someone else has to do it for them. And the question, of course, is, well, who decides who that is? Well, it's actually, I think, legally speaking, at least in the present time, it would be the next in line, the next adult in line to the throne. So let's say, for example, that suddenly something happened to both King Charles and Prince William in the line of succession in the British monarchy. Well, the regent at that point, if young Prince George became king, the regent in that case would be Prince Harry. He would be the next adult in line for the throne after his niece and nephews. So yeah, that's how it would go. How that would go today.
Britain's dominant geopolitical position was all the more impressive considering the fact that of the 5 great powers, Britain was the 4th most populous. But the picture becomes more clear when you look at wealth. In 1815, the British people were on average the wealthiest people in the world, at least 50% wealthier than their counterparts on the continent. This trend would continue for the rest of the century.
And this is one of the reasons why, even though for a lot of the wars of the coalitions, in other words, the wars against Napoleon, for a lot of that, the British weren't actively involved on the ground with massive armies in Europe. But they were funding a lot of it. They were given a lot of money because they had a lot of money, especially because of their overseas colonies.
And by the year 1900, they would be almost twice as wealthy as the average European. This incredible wealth and geopolitical security helped produce a uniquely robust political culture with lively debates and an informed electorate. In 1815, the British Prime Minister was the Earl of Liverpool, a kind of centrist conservative. The fact that he was kind of conservative was a huge deal. It was the manifestation of a seismic shift going on within British politics. Let me explain why. Since the 17th century, there had been 2 political factions within the British Parliament. The Whigs, a liberal faction who favored giving Parliament more power, and the Tories, a conservative faction who favored giving the king more power.
And so that term Tories, if you're an American, you'll hear used a lot during the American Revolution to describe loyalists, people who were loyal to the monarchy. In the United States, they called them Tories. In fact, this piece of this tree that I have right here, this is a piece of a tree that was called the Tory oak. A couple of my ancestors were hanged down in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, from that oak because they were Tories. They were loyalist Americans.
England in the 17th century was utterly consumed by the power struggle between these two factions. They even fought a civil war over it. Over the course of this struggle, England swung wildly between having an authoritarian king and no king at all, sending one to the grave and another into exile. By the end of the 17th century, the question was settled. The Whigs won. Parliament became the supreme political authority in England, and the monarchy began to fade into the background. This brought about a really strange period in British politics, something that will never happen again. For more than 100 years, every British Prime Minister was a Whig. This period is sometimes called the Whig supremacy or the Whig domination, sometimes even the Whig oligarchy. I like the term Whig oligarchy because it gets at one of the key political truths of this period. I described the Whigs as the faction of Parliament, but it might be more accurate to describe them as the faction of modernity and industrialization. This meant that Whig political power emanated from cities and business and capital.
And because you have one side or one kind of ideology dominating for that long of a time, when that happens, you inevitably have a shift of the country strongly in that direction, probably from which it will not return fully. It's not going to go all the way back to where it was before that domination happened. It's, I think, sometimes referred to, I think I've heard the term Overton window referred to, and I don't want to get into all of that, but when you have a shift of that window, in other words, what was once considered conservative and what's considered liberal, that whole idea has shifted to a different place.
While Tory political power emanated from aristocratic landowners and the countryside. At the time, the Whig modernist and pro-business worldview called for free trade and religious toleration, alongside a slow and steady expansion of political rights. The Whigs had a general distaste for slavery in all its forms, even while they continued to participate in the business of slavery. So for more than 100 years, the Whigs dominated British politics, and for the first 50 or 60 years, there were basically no close elections.
And to talk about slavery right in this period here, which is actually in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, you have the British outlawing the slave trade, and then another generation will go by before they actually outlaw slavery itself in the British Empire. Slavery, for the most part, doesn't really exist in Britain itself anymore at this point, but it still exists within the empire.
The Whigs routinely won 300 to 400 seats in Parliament, and the other factions were lucky to break 100. With such a dominant command over Parliament, it was only a matter of time before the Whig faction started to develop its own factions, and then factions within factions, and then factions within factions within factions. This competition between sub-factions actually made elections competitive again, and in the 1770s, Britain elected its first Whig prime minister from the conservative sub-faction. During the French Revolution, perhaps in reaction to the French Revolution.
So again, talking about that idea of the shift in things. So if you have Whigs and Tories and everything has shifted toward the Whigs, well, now the new liberal and conservative are what exists between that part of the window of Whigs, right? So the liberals, or the conservative Whigs, are the closest that you get to the Tories, but still probably considered liberal for a Tory, if you understand what I mean.
Britain elected several more conservative Whig prime ministers, but they all took great care to calm people's nerves and make it clear that they were all still Whigs. They were all members of one big political party. One was brave enough to brand himself as an independent Whig, whatever that means, but nobody dared go any further. So by 1814, Lord Liverpool, another conservative Whig, was prime minister. But he was in an impossible situation. His conservative Whig majority in Parliament was modest, and his sub-faction seemed to be falling apart. 4 men were asked to form a government before him, and all 4 failed to hold the coalition together. The only reason Liverpool was able to get the job done was because although he was a conservative Whig, he was on the liberal end of the conservative Whig spectrum.
So, for my American friends who maybe aren't real familiar with the parliamentary form of government, when they talk about forming a government, here in the United States, we elect the head of our government, our president, who's also head of state, independently of our Congress. But imagine a system in which whoever is the Speaker of the House is the president. And then imagine within the House elections that you have 3 or 4 different factions, none of whom receive a majority. Well, in order to be able to elect a Speaker of the House, who is the equivalent to, who's really the Prime Minister in this form, you have to put together enough that you have a majority of those people, because that's who's going to select your leader. So in order to get a Prime Minister, in order to be able to form a government, you've got to have a majority of Parliament. And sometimes that means bringing together factions if your own faction doesn't have a majority on its own.
I spoke of factions within factions within factions before. I was not joking. As soon as peace was announced, protests started popping up all over England, calling for bread or blood. One publication at the time wrote that, quote, all the triumphant sensations of national glory seem almost obliterated by general depression. Change was in the air.
So they've been so focused on this war with Napoleon. And of course, at the same time as this, they're finishing up a war with the United States, the War of 1812, which ends at the end of 1814. So once the focus is off of the international stage, now the focus returns to home. Oh, by the way, there's a lot of problems we need to deal with here at home that we've kind of not been focused on because we've been so focused on this enemy or enemies abroad.
It was not a good time to be a conservative politician in Britain. In fact, it seemed entirely possible that the conservative Whig moment was simply a reaction to the French Revolution. And with peace, the liberal Whig natural order may just reassert itself. All of that is simply a long-winded way of saying that when it was time to negotiate with the other great powers, Liverpool found himself politically constrained from every direction. If the negotiations went badly, he could not only be thrown out of government, but the conservative Whig sub-faction could be wiped out forever. The peace negotiations would be handled by the British Foreign Secretary, the Viscount of Castlereagh. Castlereagh had strong opinions when it came to Europe. There were some pro-war nuts in the conservative Whig sub-faction, but he was not one of them. Castlereagh's view was that every British intervention on the continent was a colossal policy failure. If he had his way, Britain would never again send an army to Europe. One of the reasons Castlereagh thought this way is because he was an imperialist. As Hobsbawm said, Britain at this time was virtually the only colonial power in the world. Some of the more liberal Whigs had mixed feelings about that, but Castlereagh didn't. He thought it was awesome. He believed that Britain's future was out in the colonies, and it would be best for Britain if Europe remained stable and peaceful and boring.
Kind of a Brexit type of thing, right? We'll stay out. We're not part of Europe. Let Europe do Europe's thing. We're going to worry about our colonies that we've got all over the world, and we're going to kind of do our own thing here. All of this is really important stuff, and I'm glad that he has chosen to go into the discussion of the Congress of Vienna by taking this really detailed look at each of these powers, because it's so important to understand the agendas that are brought into this and how that impacts how it all unfolds, because everybody's got agendas. And that's true in every kind of post-war situation. We talk a lot about the one in World War II, where so much of even the war policy was being motivated by a view to the post-war world and what that was going to look like and how they hoped it all shaped out, rather than just strictly worrying about winning the war.
There was some hypocrisy at work here. Peace between the great powers meant that nobody was allowed to touch any of Britain's new conquests. Peace between the great powers meant that Britain could instead maintain its advantage and focus on making money off of its colonies. All of that being said, Liverpool and Castlereagh genuinely wanted peace. The British public had been exhausted by the war, and if the conservative Whigs wanted to maintain their majority, they were going to have to show some results. Together, Liverpool and Castlereagh came up with a list of specific goals for the upcoming negotiations. The most important item was that they wanted the Netherlands reformed and strengthened on the English Channel. Two reasons for this. First, they wanted an ally on the continent to break up any consolidation along the coast.
And remember, the ties between Britain and the Netherlands go back to not very long before this, when you actually have a Dutch couple, not a Dutch couple, I shouldn't say, because Mary wasn't really Dutch, but William III of England, king, I guess not just of England, but he's William of Orange, right? And he comes across and becomes the king in England. So strong ties with the Dutch there.
Second, this was historically a natural path for French expansion, and going forward, the British wanted to cut that off. Along these same lines, they also wanted the French out of Spain, and Spain restored to its previous borders under its previous monarch. Castlereagh also had instructions to make sure that the new peace deal would keep Italy free from French influence. Historically, every time the French started messing around with Italy, it meant that France was becoming way too powerful. No more. Going forward, Italy would be a red line. Castlereagh had other goals as well, but the big ones were all about containing France.
Yep.
Before the peace negotiations began, Castlereagh back-channeled his list of priorities to both Austria and Prussia, and got from them an unofficial thumbs up. At least two of the other great powers wouldn't oppose any of Britain's big-ticket items, and France wasn't exactly in a place to put up much of a fight. The only remaining unknown going into the negotiations was Russia. Nobody quite knew what they wanted or what their intentions were.
And Russia had kind of been on both sides, right? For a while, they were at peace with Napoleon, and it was only when Napoleon kind of broke that and goes on his disastrous invasion of Russia that Russia really comes down firmly on the side of the coalition. They'd kind of gone back and forth a little bit. So we're going to wrap it up right there. We got so far to go. We're only about a third of the way into this first video, and there are two of them. But it's a lot to unpack. I'm excited to continue this conversation. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Please hit that like button if you would. And we'll see you again tomorrow with part 2. Thanks for watching.